It was the summer of 1875 when Thomas Mitchell found himself standing at the edge of a dusty, barren plain in Arizona, the sun high in the sky, blazing down with unforgiving heat. His uniform was covered in the sweat and grime of the long journey, and he had been traveling for days without rest. Yet there was no time to stop. The mission was urgent and time was running out. Thomas was a scout for the United States military, a man trained in the art of tracking and surviving in the harsh desert. But despite his many years of service, there was something about this mission that made him uneasy. He had faced danger many times before, whether from the elements or from skirmishes with the Apache tribe, but this time felt different. He wasn't simply scouting for enemy movements or looking for fresh water. This time, he was supposed to rescue 4 Apache women who had been captured by another group of warriors. The news of the women's capture had come to Thomas through official channels. They had been taken by a group of Apache warriors, likely as part of an ongoing dispute between tribes. What made this situation different, though, was that the women were not prisoners in the traditional sense. They had been separated from their people and forced to survive on their own. This was no simple rescue mission. The women were caught between 2 worlds, caught between their Apache heritage and the world the soldiers represented. And for some reason that made Thomas pause. As he trudged through the desert, he thought about what he had been taught over the years. The Apache had always been seen as the enemy. In the stories of his fellow soldiers, the Apache were painted as nothing more than savage warriors who fought to resist the encroaching forces of the U.S. government and settlers like himself. For Thomas, these ideas had been easy to accept at first. He had never questioned the orders he was given, never questioned the reason he fought. It was just what he had been taught to do. But something had started to change in him over the past few months. Perhaps it was the long hours spent traveling through the desert, the solitude forcing him to reflect on his life and his choices. Or maybe it was the few brief encounters he'd had with the Apache on scouting missions that made him start to think differently. He'd seen their families, wives, children, elders, fighting to survive just like any other group of people. He had witnessed their resilience in ways that made him wonder whether he had been wrong all along. Now, here he was, on a mission to rescue these women who might very well be just like those families he had seen in passing. But despite this growing empathy, he knew that the mission still had to be completed. His orders were clear. Find the Apache women and bring them back to military custody. It didn't matter how he felt about them personally. As Thomas continued his journey through the scorching desert, he found himself questioning everything he had been taught about the Apache. How could they be considered the enemy if they were just fighting for their land and their freedom, much like any other people would do? And yet these thoughts troubled him. He was a soldier after all. His duty was to follow orders no matter what. The thought of questioning those orders was something he wasn't sure he was ready to face. He stopped for a moment, wiping the sweat from his brow. The landscape before him stretched out in all directions, an endless sea of sand and rock. It was a place that could break the spirit of even the most seasoned traveler. But Thomas had learned to survive in places like this. He had learned to find his way, to keep moving forward, no matter the obstacles in his path. As he looked around, his eyes caught a glimpse of something, a flicker of movement in the distance. Thomas instinctively dropped to the ground and crouched low, peering through the dust and heat. He had learned over the years to always be on alert, to trust his instincts. The movement was subtle, but it was there. Someone or something was out there. For a few moments he stayed still, watching carefully. Then, just as quickly as it appeared, the movement vanished. Thomas wasn't sure if it was a figment of his imagination or if he had truly seen something, but his gut told him that he was not alone. He had to be cautious. There was no telling who or what might be watching him in this desolate land. Taking a deep breath, Thomas rose to his feet and continued his journey. The desert seemed to stretch on forever, each step feeling heavier than the last. As the hours passed, he began to wonder if he was even on the right path. The heat was unbearable, and there had been no sign of life for miles. He had no way of knowing if the women were still alive, or if they had already been moved to another location. His mind wandered back to the mission. What if he was too late? What if the women were already lost to him? The thought made his heart heavy. He had been given this responsibility, and it weighed on him. He wasn't sure why it mattered so much to him. After all, he had rescued people before. women and children who had been displaced by the conflict, prisoners from other tribes. He had completed missions like this many times, but this time felt different. There was something about these women, something he couldn't quite place, that tugged at his heart. Perhaps it was because they weren't just captives. They were survivors like him. They had endured hardships that Thomas couldn't fully comprehend. The longer he spent in the desert, the more he felt a connection to them. He didn't know who they were or what their lives had been like before their capture, but he knew they had faced the same hardships as him. They had lived through the same brutal reality of survival in a harsh, unforgiving world. By the time the sun began to set, Thomas had made little progress. The horizon was a blur of orange and red, the sky turning dark as nightfall approached. He had to make camp soon, but he couldn't afford to lose any more time. He had to keep moving forward. He couldn't let the women down. They depended on him. Even if he didn't understand why, he had made it his mission to bring them back no matter what it took. That night, as he sat by his small fire, he stared into the flames, lost in thought. His journey had only just begun, but already, he felt like he was on the edge of something far bigger than he had anticipated. There was more to this mission than just following orders. Something in him had shifted, something that made him question everything he had ever known. He didn't know what the future held. But for the first time in a long while, Thomas felt uncertain. And yet, in that uncertainty, there was a strange sense of freedom. He was beginning to see that the world was not as black and white as he had once thought. The Apache were not just the enemy. They were people with their own stories, their own struggles, and their own fight for survival. As the desert night grew colder, Thomas lay back and stared up at the stars. He had no idea what lay ahead, but one thing was clear. This mission was going to change him in ways he couldn't yet imagine. The sun had just begun its descent below the horizon when Thomas Mitchell found himself pushing forward once more. The desert was vast and unforgiving, the heat of the day now giving way to the chilly bite of night. He had been traveling for days, each step feeling heavier than the last. His water was running low and his food supplies were nearly gone. But he couldn't afford to stop. The mission had to be completed. As Thomas walked through the relentless landscape, he began to reflect on the distance he had already covered and how far he still had to go. The land stretched out before him like an endless sea of sand and rocks. The heat had drained him, and every step he took felt like it demanded all of his energy. The sun had burned his skin, and the wind carried with it the scent of dust and dry earth. He was tired in a way he hadn't felt before. There were no signs of life in this vast, barren place. No birds, no insects, just the occasional gust of wind that stirred the sand beneath his boots. The emptiness of the desert seemed to echo the emptiness he felt within. As much as he had trained for situations like this, as much as he had learned to survive alone in the wild, this time it felt different. This time it wasn't just about staying alive. It was about something much more complicated. He wasn't just a soldier following orders. The women he was trying to save weren't just prisoners, they were survivors. And their survival was connected to his own journey in ways he couldn't yet understand. During his time in the military, Thomas had often heard stories about the Apache. He had been told they were fierce, dangerous warriors who lived by a code of survival. He had been warned to always be on guard, never to trust them, and to remember that they were the enemy. But the more he thought about it, the more those stories felt distant and hollow. He had met Apache people before during his travels, and he had seen the same struggles and determination in their eyes that he had seen in the eyes of his own people. They weren't just warriors. They were human beings, fighting for their survival in a world that seemed intent on taking everything from them. The thought of the women he was supposed to rescue haunted him. What would they be like? How had they survived on their own in this unforgiving desert? Thomas couldn't help but imagine the hardships they must have faced, how they had managed to hold on when everything seemed lost. He had heard they were resourceful, clever, and strong, but he knew he would soon find out for himself. As much as he had been trained to handle any situation, there was a part of him that felt unsure of what would come next. As the days passed, the landscape began to change. The barren stretches of sand gave way to rocky hills, and the terrain became more challenging. The sun was no longer his only enemy. The nights were cold, and the wind cut through his clothes, making it hard to sleep. Yet despite the discomfort, Thomas pressed on. His sense of duty to complete the mission kept him going. even when his body begged him to stop. One evening, as the sky shifted from the pale blue of afternoon to the deep shades of twilight, Thomas found himself at the base of a jagged cliff. He had stopped for a brief rest when he noticed something odd in the distance. There, among the rocks, a small plume of smoke rose into the air. It was thin, barely noticeable, but it was enough to catch his attention. Could this be the Apache camp he had been tracking? Thomas instinctively crouched low, careful not to make a sound. His hand gripped the rifle slung across his back, but he didn't want to be too hasty. He knew that rushing into a situation like this could be dangerous. The Apache were known for their sharp eyes and quick reflexes, and any wrong move could lead to disaster. For a moment he considered turning back, but something inside him urged him forward. He needed to know if the women were near. As he moved closer, he felt his heart beat faster. The quiet of the desert, broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind, made everything feel more intense. With each step, the smoke grew closer, and he could make out faint shapes in the distance. There were figures moving around the camp, small, fluid movements. It was hard to tell exactly what was happening, but Thomas had learned to trust his instincts. The air felt heavy with tension, and he knew he had to be careful. When he reached a vantage point high on a rock ledge, he peered down at the camp below. He could see several tents arranged in a circle, with a small fire crackling in the center. Around the fire, a few figures were seated, but it wasn't the warriors he was focused on. His eyes searched the perimeter for any sign of the women. And then, almost out of nowhere, he saw them. 4 women sitting on the ground, their faces hidden in the shadows of the tents. They looked weary, like they had been through something difficult. Their clothes were torn, their hair messy, and their bodies showed signs of exhaustion. But there was something else, something that caught Thomas's attention. Even in their tired state, the women moved with a certain grace, their bodies alert and watchful. They were not defeated. Despite everything they had endured, they remained strong. For a moment, Thomas was frozen. The sight of them hit him in a way he didn't expect. They were not the helpless victims he had imagined. They were survivors. His mind raced. How had they managed to stay alive in this hostile environment? What had they done to protect themselves from the dangers of the desert? And what would happen to them if he didn't act soon? Thomas knew he couldn't afford to wait any longer. If he was going to save them, he had to move quickly. The smoke he had seen earlier was his signal. This was where the women were being held. But how could he get them out? The Apache warriors were not the only danger. The desert itself could kill them if they didn't escape soon. He began to strategize, thinking about how to approach the camp without drawing attention. It wouldn't be easy. He had no idea how many warriors were present or what kind of traps might be waiting for him, but Thomas was determined. He had come this far, and there was no turning back now. That night, as he lay awake in his makeshift camp, his mind kept returning to the women. He thought about their lives, their journey, and what had led them to this moment. He couldn't help but wonder about the stories they carried with them, stories that might change everything he thought he knew about the Apache. He didn't know what the future held, but he knew that this mission had already changed him. In saving these women, he would face not just the dangers of the desert, but the larger question of what it meant to be a part of this world, one where survival sometimes meant making impossible choices. The night passed quietly, with only the occasional breeze sweeping through the desert. Thomas lay awake staring at the stars, his mind racing. The plan to rescue the 4 Apache women weighed heavily on him. The more he thought about it, the more complicated it seemed. He had watched them from the ledge the night before, seeing them huddled together near the fire. They didn't look like prisoners, not in the way he had expected. They weren't broken. They weren't cowering. They had a quiet strength about them that made him respect them even more. But as dawn approached, he knew that staying hidden and watching from afar wasn't enough. He had to act. The longer he waited, the more chances there were that something would go wrong. The Apache warriors could move camp, or worse, the women might be taken somewhere far out of his reach. So, with a deep breath and a silent prayer, Thomas gathered his things and began his descent down the rock ledge. His heart pounded in his chest, but he pushed the fear aside. This was his mission, his responsibility. He moved as quietly as he could, his boots barely making a sound on the rocky ground. Every step was calculated, and his eyes scanned the camp ahead for any movement. The sun had not yet risen, and the air was cool, the desert still shrouded in the last moments of night. The shadows cast by the rocks and tents made it easier to stay out of sight. but Thomas knew that he had only one chance at this. One mistake and everything could go wrong. He crept closer, his every sense alert. The camp was still. There were a few Apache warriors near the fire, sitting in silence, their eyes distant as they kept watch. The women, however, had moved closer to one of the tents. Thomas saw their figures in the dim light, still huddled together, whispering among themselves, perhaps comforting each other in their uncertain circumstances. Thomas's heart swelled with sympathy. These were not the frightened captives he had been expecting. The women didn't look helpless. They were survivors. And in that moment, Thomas realized that rescuing them was about more than just bringing them back to safety. It was about offering them a chance to return to their people, to a life they had been robbed of. As he moved closer, he spotted a gap between the tents. It was narrow, but it was the perfect way in. Slowly, cautiously, he approached. His eyes never left the warriors near the fire, watching for any sign of movement. He knew they couldn't afford to see him. If they did, everything would fall apart. His heart raced as he reached the gap and squeezed through, careful not to make a sound. The air around him was still, and the camp was bathed in a soft glow from the dying embers of the fire. It felt like the entire world was holding its breath. Then he saw her. One of the women. She was the one who stood apart from the others. She was sitting on a small rock, her back straight, her eyes scanning the camp with a quiet intensity. Thomas was struck by her presence. There was something about her, something strong and unwavering in the way she carried herself. She wasn't just another face in the crowd. There was leadership in her gaze, something that told him she had been through a great deal and had come out the other side with strength, not bitterness. As Thomas watched her, he realized that this mission was no longer just about completing an order. It was about something much deeper, something that made his heart ache with the need to protect these women, to give them a chance at a life beyond captivity. This woman, with her clear, unyielding gaze, had become the focus of his thoughts. He shook himself from his reverie. Now was not the time to get lost in thoughts. There was still work to do. He needed to act quickly before the situation changed. He had already spotted the gap in the camp's defenses, but it wasn't enough to simply escape with the women. The Apache warriors might notice their absence, and they would be quick to follow. Thomas needed a plan, a way to get them out of the camp and into safety without drawing attention to themselves. His mind worked fast. He looked at the small pile of firewood near the edge of the camp. It was a risky move, but if he could create a distraction, it might give them the cover they needed. The fire had been burning low and the wind was picking up. If he could light a small flame and send it towards the wood, it could spark a much larger fire. It wouldn't take much, just a little spark and a breeze, and it would send the entire camp into disarray. The warriors would have to focus on putting out the fire, giving Thomas and the women the time they needed to escape. The idea made his heart race. It was a gamble, but it was their best shot. He glanced over at the woman again. She hadn't noticed him yet, but he could see that she was becoming more alert. Her eyes darted around the camp, and he could sense that she was aware of something, even if she didn't know exactly what it was. This was it. Thomas moved quickly, sliding through the shadows until he was close enough to the firewood. He reached down and picked up a small stick, one that had been dropped earlier. With a steady hand, he scraped it against the rough stone, and in a moment a small flame appeared. His breath caught as he carefully fed the flame to the wood, watching it catch fire. He blew lightly on it, encouraging it to spread. The wind was on his side, pushing the fire toward the larger pile of wood. It wasn't long before the fire began to grow, crackling as it spread quickly. A few of the warriors near the fire turned toward the sound. The woman Thomas had been watching reacted immediately. She stood up, her face hardening with purpose. She had seen the smoke, and she knew what it meant. She was no stranger to danger. Thomas could see it in the way she moved, swift, sure, and calm. She turned toward the others, whispering something to them. The other three women stood up, their movements quiet but deliberate. They had been waiting for a chance like this. They were ready. For a moment, everything seemed to slow down. The fire grew bigger, the smoke billowing into the air. The warriors near the fire were scrambling, trying to put it out. But it was too late. The distraction had worked. Thomas felt a surge of relief, but it was short-lived. Now came the hardest part, getting them out of the camp before the warriors could regroup. He motioned to the woman, signaling her to follow him. She nodded, understanding immediately. Without a word, she led the others toward the gap in the tents. They moved quickly, blending into the shadows as best as they could. The sound of the fire crackling behind them and the shouts of the warriors added urgency to their steps. They were running out of time. As Thomas led them toward the safety of the rocky hills, he couldn't help but glance at the woman again. She was leading the others, her eyes scanning the path ahead. In that moment, he realized something. She wasn't just helping him, she was helping herself and her people. She was a warrior in her own right, even if she had never held a weapon. She was fighting for survival just as he was. And as they disappeared into the desert night, Thomas knew that nothing would ever be the same again. As the small group of women followed Thomas through the rocky terrain, the sound of the fire behind them faded into the distance. The cool desert night air felt like a relief against the heat they had endured during the day. Thomas glanced over his shoulder, ensuring that they weren't being followed. The darkness of the desert seemed endless, and the rocky hills provided a perfect cover. He could hear the occasional rustling of the wind, but otherwise the night was quiet. The woman who had caught his attention earlier led the group with purpose, her movements fluid and silent. She wasn't the least bit rattled by the commotion they had left behind. In fact, she seemed to be more focused than ever. Thomas couldn't help but admire her calmness. There was a quiet strength in the way she moved, a determination that he hadn't seen in many of the people he had encountered on his journeys. It was clear that she wasn't afraid of what lay ahead. She was a survivor, just like him. As they moved further into the desert, Thomas began to feel a sense of urgency. The warriors would realize soon enough that their camp had been disrupted. It wouldn't take them long to start looking for the women, and Thomas knew they wouldn't stop until they found them. He had to keep moving, keep them ahead of the danger. His instincts told him that they couldn't afford to stop for long. After about an hour of steady walking, Thomas motioned for the group to pause. The rocky hills were giving way to a small patch of scrubland. There were a few sparse bushes here and there, and a cluster of cacti stood like silent sentinels in the dark. It wasn't much, but it would provide some cover. He led them to a small crevice between two large boulders, where they could rest and regroup for a while. The woman who had been leading the group, her eyes sharp and focused, turned toward him. There was something about the way she looked at him, something that made Thomas feel as if she could see right through him. It was as though she knew exactly what he was thinking. She didn't say anything, but the silence between them spoke volumes. He wasn't sure what to make of it, but he felt an odd sense of connection to her, as though their paths had crossed for a reason. He had always been taught to keep his emotions in check, to stay focused on the task at hand. But something about this woman, this group of women, was beginning to chip away at that wall he had built around himself. They weren't just people to be rescued. They were individuals, each with their own story, their own fight. And Thomas was beginning to understand that their struggle wasn't so different from his own. As they settled into the small, rocky shelter, the women gathered in a tight circle. Their faces were tired, their eyes filled with a mix of relief and uncertainty. They were free, yes, but their journey wasn't over yet. They still had to survive. They still had to make it through the desert, and that was no small task. Thomas could see the hesitation in their eyes. They didn't know him. He was a stranger, a soldier, someone who represented the forces that had taken their people from them. And yet, they had trusted him to get them this far. The woman who had led the group, Thomas still didn't know her name, finally spoke, her voice low but steady. "Where are we going?" Her words were simple, but they carried weight. She wasn't asking out of fear, but out of practicality. She needed to know the next step, just like he did. Thomas hesitated for a moment. He hadn't thought that far ahead. His mission had been to get them out of the camp and away from the warriors, but beyond that, he wasn't sure where they should go. The desert was vast, and there were few places to hide. They couldn't stay in one spot for too long, or they risked being found. But he wasn't ready to give up yet. He had come too far to let them down now. "We'll head toward the mountains," Thomas finally said, his voice steady. "It's the best place to hide. It's a long way, but we'll be safer there." The woman nodded, her eyes never leaving his. She didn't question him. She just accepted it, as if she had known that this was their only option all along. There was no time for doubt, no time for second-guessing. The night was their only ally now. As they prepared to leave, Thomas noticed the other women. They were quieter than the woman who had spoken. but there was a certain strength in their silence. They didn't need to say much. It was clear they trusted her and they trusted him, at least for the moment. The trust was fragile, like the desert air, but it was enough to keep them moving forward. Thomas led the way again, keeping a steady pace. The path through the desert was treacherous with loose rocks and uneven terrain that made it difficult to keep up speed, but they pressed on one step at a time. The moon had risen higher in the sky, casting an eerie glow over the landscape. The mountains loomed in the distance, still far enough away to feel like a lifetime of walking. The woman walked beside Thomas, her eyes scanning the desert, always alert. Every now and then she would glance at him, but she didn't speak. Thomas couldn't help but feel a sense of respect for her strength, for the way she carried herself with such quiet authority. She was different from the people he had known, different from the soldiers he had fought alongside. She wasn't trying to prove anything. She just was, and that was something Thomas found difficult to understand, but also something he admired deeply. As they moved forward, the silence between them grew more comfortable. It wasn't an uncomfortable silence, but one of mutual understanding. Neither of them spoke, yet both knew what the other was thinking. The desert had a way of making people reflect, and in that quiet, Thomas began to understand the weight of the choice he had made. His life had been one of duty and order. He had always followed the rules, always done what was expected of him. But this mission, this rescue, it was changing him in ways he hadn't expected. The more time he spent with these women, the more he realized how little he knew about the world he had been living in. He had always seen things in black and white, right and wrong, soldier and enemy. But the lines were beginning to blur. These women weren't just captives, they were people with their own lives, their own families, their own hopes. And as they walked together through the desert night, Thomas knew that his journey with them was far from over. The mountains were still a long way off, but the path ahead was clear. They would face challenges, they would struggle, but they would do it together. And for the first time in a long time, Thomas felt like he was on the right path. As the days passed, the journey grew even more difficult. The desert had a way of wearing people down, its unforgiving nature taking its toll on every step. The heat during the day was stifling, and the nights were cold and uncomfortable. The small group of women, though strong, were starting to show the signs of fatigue. Their faces were drawn and their bodies moved with less energy, but they never complained. They had learned to survive, to keep moving no matter the circumstances. Thomas, too, was growing weary. His legs ached from the constant walking, and his throat was dry from the lack of water, but he never slowed his pace. His mission had become more than just rescuing these women. It had become about helping them find a future beyond the desert. He couldn't shake the feeling that their fates were intertwined now, that he had to see this through to the end. He had made a promise to them, even if he hadn't said it aloud. And like the desert itself, Thomas was unyielding. He noticed the woman who had been leading them, her name was Ayanna, he had learned, was starting to look more tired than usual. She still moved with purpose, but her shoulders had started to sag under the weight of the journey. He could see the burden in her eyes. Ayanna was the one who had kept them going when the rest of the women grew discouraged, the one who had found ways to keep spirits high even when things seemed hopeless. But now Thomas could see the cracks in her armor. One evening, as they set up camp beneath a cluster of rocky hills, Ayanna sat down by the fire, her hands resting in her lap. The other women were scattered around tending to their own tasks, but Ayanna didn't move. She just stared at the fire, lost in her thoughts. Thomas approached her quietly, not wanting to disturb her, but feeling the need to check on her. He had grown to care about her, not in a romantic way, but in a way that made him want to ensure her well-being. There was something about the strength she carried, the leadership she exhibited, that had made him feel both protective and deeply respectful. "You're tired," Thomas said softly, sitting down beside her. It wasn't a question. It was an observation. Ayanna didn't look at him at first, but he could see the faintest nod of her head. "It's not just my body," she replied quietly, her voice low but steady. "It's my mind. The journey, the uncertainty, it wears on you after a while. You try to keep hope alive, but sometimes it feels like we're moving toward nothing." Thomas nodded. He understood what she meant. He had spent most of his life walking in the direction of something that seemed far away, and in many ways he had felt the same sense of hopelessness. But there was something different about this moment, something different about Ayanna. For the first time since this mission began, Thomas realized that he was no longer just trying to survive the journey. He was starting to care for the people around him, to see them as individuals rather than just faces to be saved. "You've done more than most could," Thomas said, his voice quiet but sincere. "You've led your people. You've kept everyone going. We've made it this far because of you." Ayanna finally looked at him then, her gaze meeting his with a soft intensity. "It's not just me. We all keep each other going. We've survived this far because we've had no other choice." Thomas looked at the fire for a moment, the crackling sound filling the silence between them. There was truth in her words, but something else was there too, something that neither of them had spoken aloud but both knew. They were fighting for something bigger than survival now. They were fighting for their futures. The next few days were filled with more walking, more silent exchanges, and more moments of quiet reflection. The mountain range they had been heading toward was finally in sight, looming like a distant promise. It wasn't an easy trek, but it felt like hope. It felt like they were moving toward something more than just escape. They were moving toward a place where they could find peace. As they neared the base of the mountains, the landscape began to change. The desert, with its wide expanses and open sky, began to give way to thicker vegetation. Small shrubs and hardy trees dotted the ground, providing some relief from the harsh landscape they had been walking through. It was a small change, but it gave the group new energy. Even the women seemed to walk with a little more purpose, their steps growing steadier as they climbed higher into the foothills. On the fourth day of the journey, after a particularly grueling hike, Thomas found a spot near a small stream where they could rest. The water was clear and cold, and it seemed to be an oasis in the middle of the dry, rocky landscape. For the first time in days, Thomas allowed himself to relax. He knelt by the water, cupping his hands to drink, and for a moment everything felt peaceful. It was a brief respite in the midst of the long journey, but it was enough. Ayanna sat down beside him, her eyes still sharp but less burdened than before. She watched him for a moment, then spoke again, her voice soft but with a weight that was hard to ignore. "I've been thinking," she said, her gaze moving toward the mountains in the distance. "If we make it there, what will happen? What happens to us?" Thomas didn't have an answer. He had never allowed himself to think too far ahead. He had always focused on the next step, the immediate goal. But now, as Ayanna asked the question, he realized that he too didn't know what would come next. They had no guarantee of safety in the mountains. They had no guarantee that anyone would be there to help them. All they had was each other. "We'll keep moving forward," Thomas said quietly, meeting her gaze. "We'll find a way, together." Ayanna smiled, though it was a tired smile, one that spoke of the long road ahead. "Together," she repeated, as if the word held some deeper meaning for both of them. It was a word that spoke of unity, of shared purpose, and of the strength that came from relying on each other. That night, as they camped beneath the stars, Thomas lay on his back, staring up at the vast expanse of the sky. The journey had been hard, and it wasn't over yet, but he felt a sense of peace that had eluded him for most of his life. He was no longer just a soldier. He was part of something bigger, something more important than anything he had known before. And in that moment, he understood what it meant to truly fight for something worth saving. The road ahead was still uncertain, but Thomas knew one thing for sure. No matter where it took them, they would face it together.